Everyone tells you should be spending some time practicing scales, but it can be confusing when you're new to piano because there's loads of different types of scale and each one has 12 keys you could learn it into, 12 different notes to start each type from. There's no perfect order to learn in to suit everyone, and we have to be flexible with our approach to suit what we're doing, but there's definitely some more useful ways to do things nearer the start. I'm going to try and give you a simple overview talking about different types of scales and then orders of keys within those types of scales to help. The first thing I want to say is that we don't have to learn one type of scale in all 12 keys before moving on to another type of scale. We can get one set on the go and then stagger it so you're learning different groups of scales simultaneously. And that's often better actually because it means you get a wider variety of things and it's helping you target those particular types in particular keys that you're probably going to encounter more early on. Eventually we want to complete the set of each type, but there's no real rush in the beginning. Remember, we can be flexible how we do things. When you're completely new to piano, the most common and useful scales to learn first are major scales. Most piano teachers would start you off on these. They're the simplest group to start with as a whole, technically. The most foundational and helpful to start with in terms of theory. You'll likely use them more often. It usually makes the most sense to start with C major as it has no black keys, and so it's the clearest to visualize and tends to be the easiest to start learning, reading, or understanding music in. From there, it's useful technically and visually to start learning these keys next because they all use the same fingering to play them, which is helpful. And in this order, they add one extra black key each time, which kind of builds you up. They're all sharps in this case. If you know the circle of fifths, which essentially just organizes the keys, you can see these scales are the first 5 starting from C. You can also throw in learning F major earlier on amongst learning these as well, as it only has one black key, but it's a flat this time. So it's simpler to picture on the keyboard or read music in that key, so you're more likely to learn music in this key earlier on. It does have a very slightly different fingering pattern in the right hand to those other 5 though. The next one around the circle of fifths, B major, is also very similar to these scales as well, so you can learn that one next, but it has a slightly different fingering pattern in the left hand. I would suggest learning this lot first and then moving on to the flat side of the circle of fifths and learning these in order of how many flats are in the key. These major scales use a very different kind of fingering from the previous lot, which means they'll likely feel a little bit harder and more unfamiliar when you first start. In terms of how many octaves, I would definitely start with 1 octave on all of these scales, but then at some point you can start repeating the same order again for 2 or more octaves. But you don't have to complete all 12 in 1 octave before you start learning 2 octave scales. Just make sure at least a good few keys are solid technically in 1 octave before stretching yourself further. I also have some worksheets available from my website which include graphics and finger numbers for major scales and minor scales in every key. And there's a link for those down below in the description. Then minor scales is the next main big group. Minor and major keys are the most used tonalities in music. The thing with minor scales though is that there's a few variations we commonly use and often actually change between within one piece of music. Check out a playlist of 3 videos I have to fully understand minor scales. I'll put a link to that below as well. But those 3 types are the natural minor, the harmonic minor, and the melodic minor. The natural minor is definitely the one to learn first out of those 3, as it's kind of like a base point we use. And then from there, I would usually teach harmonic, which is 1 note different from natural, and then melodic, which is 2 notes different from natural. I tend to start people off learning A and C natural minors first. A, because it's just all the white notes, and I think that's just an easy one to get going with. And you can start learning about relative minors clearly in that key. Again, check that playlist for more on that. And then C minor, because I believe the best way to start learning scales and learn different types of scales is to understand the intervals that build them. And it's really useful to find that minor scale by adapting a major scale. It helps you picture the intervals that build it. So by that, I mean turning C major into C minor, and we could call that the parallel minor. Anyway, after those 2 keys, which I use to teach people those concepts for the first time, I think it's useful to learn these keys in the same order as the parallel majors, basically. All the minor scales, starting from the white notes, use the same fingering as their counterpart major scale. So F minor and F major have the same fingering, A major and A minor have the same fingering, and so on. That's a useful thing thing to get going. And again, I like to include F in that as it's one of the more visually simple major scales to convert to a minor scale. You can be flexible with this, but after you've learned a few of those, you could then go back and start learning the harmonic and melodic versions of those as well, where we just basically adjust some notes at the top of the scale. Again, that minor scales playlist tells you how to do that. And in these keys so far, all the fingering remains the same. Unless you have a specific need to before this, I would start learning the minor scales that start from the black keys after you've got comfortable with all those other ones first. And an organised way to do this is to start following the circle of fifths again. I mean, you could really do those in any order. It's not a big deal, but it's just helpful to be organised sometimes. And by now you're starting to get used to the 3 different types. So if you wanted, you could do 3 different types in one key, and then 3 different types in the next key, or you could go through, do all the naturals, then all the harmonics, and then all the melodics. You've got to choose what works for you. I do also have a post on my website with all this information on as well. You might like to have a look at that as a reference so you can see all this stuff written out. There's some tables and things to make it nice and clear for you. Pentatonic scales and blues scales will be really helpful. Pentatonics are just 5-note scales, and there's actually more than 2 of them, but the ones people mean when they say pentatonic scales are the major and the minor pentatonic. Once again, you may want to start learning some of these before you've completed all the major and minor scales, because you might have a use for them. Without getting too in-depth here, they're really useful as the sound of them has been used a lot throughout a long period of musical history all over the world. And they're really handy as one way to start improvisation because, to put it simply, to a degree, it tends to be much easier to make them sound good and fit with the rest of the music. It's not the only way to improvise, but it's a really useful concept we use. Major and minor blues scales then are really just one extra note added on to those pentatonic scales, and they're not the only part of, but they're obviously a big part of the blues, but also jazz and funk and rock and other more contemporary music too, derivatives of the blues. Just to point out, whilst you can focus on these for technique and do runs up and down and learn them like you would learn your major and minor scales, practicing going up and down, I think with these first, it's actually far more important to learn to see where those notes are in different keys, and learn them by getting comfortable with the sound of them and experimenting with them, what can be done with them, using them to improvise, and not necessarily focus on building up speed and that kind of thing like we might do with major scales, for example. The best keys to learn first and understand the theory of pentatonics, how they're also relative like major and minor scales, what intervals build them and that kind of stuff. Definitely learn these in C and A first. It's much clearer. And then after that, it's probably useful to learn them in F and G, as they're likely to come up a lot, particularly with blues music. And then the other keys beginning from the white notes. If you ever play in a band with a guitarist, they love playing in E because of the tuning of the guitar. So that's handy to learn as well. E flat minor pentatonic, which is the relative of G flat major pentatonic. Without going too in depth, they basically have the same notes. One starts from G flat, one starts from E flat. It's all the black keys. And as you may have seen in 1 or 2 of my older videos, this is really handy for getting started improvising, because when you're just using the black keys and you know that's the kind of world you're working within, it's much easier to not get visually lost and hit any wrong notes. Chromatic scales include every note on the piano. And I think the most useful reason to learn these is kind of a technical thing, really. It teaches you how to navigate the keyboard when you're moving around in half steps. It teaches you how to be nimble moving through these kind of shapes. And to be honest, that's going to be really handy at some point for pretty much whatever kind of music you're going to learn. Beyond that, we have something called modes, and specifically the modes of the major scale. I'm not going to get too into exactly how they work at the moment because it's its own topic. It needs its own video, but they're essentially different varieties of 7-note scales, different patterns we get when you start at different points of the major scale. They give you different kind of palettes of sound to work with, and once again, you can practice these like you would major and minor scales, just going up and down, but it's not the most useful thing to do with them. It's best to just learn what they are, what sound they have, what kind of music uses them, what you can do with them, how to understand them, rather than practicing them for technique purposes. It's harder to explain the order of these without a specific modes video, but because of the concept, the way you learn it, you kind of learn them all at the same time. But there's a couple of them I think people are more likely to find useful. So those you might want to learn independently at some point, as they'll come up more commonly. And of course, there are lots of other kind of scales too, that at some point when you get much deeper into playing music, you might want to think about learning. We have things like diminished scales and we have other modes, but I think that's as deep as we need to get in this video. I hope that was helpful. Let me know in the comments if it was, or if you have any questions. Thanks for watching.